High Tunnel Production and Low-Cost Tunnel Construction by Tim Coolong of the University of Kentucky. My name is Alice Formiga, and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. We're a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You will be able to find the recording of this webinar, information about our upcoming webinars, as well as articles, videos, and more by going to our website at www.extension.org/organic_production. We're very glad to have Tim Coolong as our speaker today. Tim is an assistant extension professor at the University of Kentucky. He works primarily with small mixed vegetable farms around the state of Kentucky. His research has focused on sustainable management for mixed vegetable production, including irrigation management, new crops, and season extension.
Well, thank you, Alice, for introducing me. I'd like to just say thank you to everyone that's attending today. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to my talk here. The talk is going to be pretty applied in nature. Most of my high tunnel work has been working with growers in the state of Kentucky, and so this is going to be a real, very applied talk in nature. Okay, I wanted to skip that slide real quick. A little bit of background about high tunnels in Kentucky. A lot of this might be specific to the mid-Atlantic or east coast of the United States. If you're doing high tunnels in the Southwest, some of this might not be applicable to you, but hopefully you'll find some good information. Like Alice said, I'm the Extension Vegetable Specialist for UK, and we're a fairly small vegetable state in terms of production acreage. We only have about 10,500 acres. But the nice thing is most of this is direct marketed. We have about 120 farmers markets in the state. We have a lot of CSA programs, produce auctions, and roadside markets. And so because of that, high tunnels are very well suited to this production system. We do have some larger wholesale growers, but it's not like some of the bigger vegetable states. And so because of that, a lot of our growers have a great interest in high tunnels. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of high tunnels, different types of tunnels that you can use, why it would be worthwhile to even use a high tunnel, important considerations, both positive and negative, what to grow in tunnels, which is kind of an exhaustive list, and then if I have time at the end of it, I'd like to cover how to build a low-cost high tunnel that we use here throughout the state for some of our demonstrations and so forth, and hopefully I'll have time to get to that. So what is a high tunnel? Most of the folks that are attending this talk probably already know, but just to define it, it's an unheated plastic covered 1 or 2 layers of plastic hoop house. Some folks in the nursery trade called these cold frames and have been using them for years, but amongst vegetable growers, they're, I wouldn't say relatively recent, but in the last 20 years, they've really taken off. It's generally a semi-permanent structure, typically with minimal or no electricity. And kind of the big thing that separates it from greenhouses is that there's no exhaust fans or cooling pads, and crops are generally grown in the soil, not in containers. So high tunnels are actually nothing new. I've been fortunate at UK to talk to some faculty that have been here for a while, and upon digging through some of the archives here, the late Dr. Emmert, who's actually in the Department of Horticulture here, really pioneered the use of plastic high tunnels back in the 50s. He called them plastic-covered greenhouses back then, and back in the 50s, most structures were glass-covered, and he really took this plasticulture to a new level. Unfortunately, the technology didn't really catch on in the United States right away, unfortunately for him. It became very significant, however, in much of Asia and parts of Europe. And so they've kind of advanced the technology much further than we have in the United States. Recently, kind of with the renaissance, they've had a renaissance in the United States as grower demographics have shifted. 25 years ago, we didn't have as many smaller direct retail farmers market growers, but now with the growth of CSAs and farmers markets and those sort of operations nationwide, there's been a renewed interest in high tunnels. Here's a picture of the late Dr. Emmert, taken in the late 1950s, actually at one of the UK farms, and that's his rudimentary structure there, covered with plastic. He also did low tunnels and so forth. But you can see that's basically, you know, the essence of a high tunnel there. Here's another clipping from some of his work. You can see some of the high tunnels there lined up in a field, and then he's growing bib lettuce actually in the picture on the top. And it just has about the different prices that he was getting. And he was getting tomatoes in June, which is kind of unusual for Kentucky. Normally field tomatoes come in after the 4th of July, and he was getting 30 cents a pound, which for 1958 was pretty good. So high tunnels have been around for quite some time, but like I said earlier, they've really taken off in other parts of the world. A colleague of mine here at UK, Dr. John Snyder, spends a significant amount of time in China, and he was kind enough to lend me a couple of these slides here. During his last visit to China, he had met with several people that dealt with agriculture, and they estimate that they have about 1.9 million hectares, which is a pretty significant amount of acreage under plastic tunnels, and there you see a picture of them. And then in addition, they have another 500,000 hectares, close to 1 million acres, in solar greenhouses. And so it's really amazing just how much protected culture is going on in different parts of the world. Here's a couple of pictures that a local grower had provided me. She recently went on a trip to China. And in China, they have, outside of town, they have little farming sightseeing areas where people that live in urban areas can come out and kind of look at farming operations, kind of get out of the city. And she went to one of their high tunnel ones, actually, and they're growing a lot of different types of brassicas and so forth. And here's a couple of pictures from those, just to show the scale that high tunnels are used in foreign countries. Here you'll see another picture of high tunnels with the plastic rolled off with some brassicas in there. And you can see the scale of it. It's quite significant. Here's some more where the plastic's removed. You can see there's, I mean, that field's probably a 50 or 60 acre field with the galvanized hoop structures in place. So very, very significant production. Here's another picture that was taken from a train, actually. And most of these tunnels are wood or bamboo frame construction. But you can see just the sea of plastic there. And these are very intensely produced and very productive. I think last week's webinar presenter, Dave Francis, talked about grafting of different vegetables. And because of the intense cultivation in Asian countries, China in particular, they're doing a lot of grafted vegetables in their high tunnels to get around some of the issues such as disease. And here's just the last shot of China, just to show the scale and the scope of high tunnel production there. So, some basics on high tunnels. A colleague of mine here, Brent Rao, did a lot of work with high tunnels, and he always said that passive solar heating required active owners. And, you know, basically in a hot, sunny day, in the wintertime, you could get up to a 50-degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature if it's sunny and clear in that high tunnel. And so therefore, although it might be 30 degrees outside, you might be starting to really bake some plants on the inside of that tunnel. So really, if you're thinking about doing a high tunnel, if I had a choice, I would very much go for something that had decent-sized sidewalls, either 4 to 5 feet tall. It allows for much better venting than either opening the end walls, particularly when you start getting into the longer tunnels. Here on the bottom right side of the slide, you'll see the picture of the high tunnel with the sidewalls. It's actually later in the year. It's full of tomatoes, indeterminate tomatoes, and you can see definitely how those sidewalls would help with ventilation. Some other options that work very well are ridge vents that are available as well. A common problem in high tunnel tomatoes, in fact, is excessive temperatures. You'll see the picture on the left side of the screen. That's a tomato with the white core in the center, and we've seen that quite a bit here in Kentucky when growers fail to open their sidewalls and get good ventilation. Temperatures can exceed 120, 130 degrees, leading to unsellable fruit. So typically your high tunnels are about 12 to 30 feet wide, anywhere from 50 to 100 feet long. There's some of the Haygrove systems that are over 600 feet long, and usually 9 to 12 feet high. So different types of high tunnels, the Haygrove tunnels. Haygroves are taller than most tunnels, and they can be connected to form very large structures. We've got some Haygroves at our organic research farm here in Lexington. You'll see them on the top left side of the screen. You'll see they're much taller than a typical structure. And then on the photo on the bottom of the screen was pulled from an ATRA publication, and you can see how they're connected together. And Haygroves are a great structure. They're a little bit more expensive than some of the other tunnels, but they do have some significant advantages. You can connect many of them together, which is nice. You can continue to expand your operation as you grow. They don't have to be placed on flat ground. As you saw in that previous picture, they can, if you have a rolling hill or something, they'll can accommodate that. Another great benefit is the height of Haygroves. We use them a lot in organic small fruit production because you can get implements in and out of them very easily, and you can grow larger crops. They're very nice for organic bramble production. We get slightly better yields, but we get a much, much higher quality product. Here we're growing organic blackberries and raspberries on the top right. There's some a blueberry plant. From what we've seen, they're not quite as effective for blueberries, although you do get some temperature benefits from them. But really, as far as quality goes, they work really, really well for those brambles. So we've been very happy with our Haygrove tunnels for that purpose. Now, your traditional high tunnels are generally a standalone structure, although you can connect several of them together to get a larger, more efficient structure. If you do decide to go with a larger structure, keep in mind that your sidewall ventilation will change then. Typically, the hoops are made of galvanized steel with fixed end walls, 1 to 2 layers of plastic, and they're around $1 to $3 a square foot, depending upon snow bracing and that sort of thing. But about $1.60 to $1.80, if you assemble it yourself, is probably a good average that you can count on. Here's a shot of a traditional high tunnel here in western Kentucky. This particular grower is growing a lot of lettuces and greens. He's got some onions in there. This has got some significant snow bracing and so forth on the sides of the tunnel. This grower uses this tunnel all season long. He does tomatoes in the spring and greens throughout the rest of the year. You'll see this tunnel has sidewalls, and that's what this grower happens to use for ventilation, so it can get quite hot in there. Here's another shot of a traditional high tunnel. This is actually was provided to me by Dr. Brent Rowell. It's from Au Natural Farm. It's a farm we have here outside of Bowling Green, Kentucky. It's Allison and Paul Wiedeker, who are high tunnel pioneers in the state, and they grow a lot of mixed greens. In the south, in the southern U.S. and the Midwest, I guess mid-Atlantic region, there's a lot of tobacco grown. And as tobacco markets are shifting, a lot of our growers here in Kentucky, we had at one time probably 70,000 tobacco farms in the state. Tobacco houses where they used to grow transplants are another type of high tunnel that people might be able to find at very reasonably priced if there was some tobacco production in their area. And so this is an option, clearly not available for much of the country, but in those parts of the country where there is a lot of tobacco production, you might be able to find one of these at a reasonable price. Our farm manager here at the University of Kentucky has worked with myself to develop kind of a low-cost UK high tunnel. I've got a small publication on eOrganic about how to build one of these. If we have time, I'll cover that at the end of my talk. These are kind of a take on a Haygrove type system. You don't need flat ground to put these in. They're very cheap, about 30 to 35 cents a square foot. That price goes down the bigger you get. They're very easy to assemble and move. It's basically a PVC pipe system with a single layer of polyethylene plastic. They're definitely not for year-round use. They're not as sturdy as traditional tunnels. But a lot of our growers use them in the spring. We use them as part of our extension demonstration program. And growers have had, at least for their first year to try this, they've had some success with early tomatoes. That's what you can see in that picture there. And in these tunnels, and then they decide if they want to do this on a larger scale. Several other companies have recently come out with small tunnels as well, and they're readily available. Here's just another shot of the inexpensive UK tunnel with the PVC pipe. You'll see how the plastic's held down with nylon rope, and we vent generally from the side. This particular tunnel is about, I think this one was about 160 feet long. Solar greenhouses, I'll touch on briefly. As you saw from the slide near the beginning of the talk, there's 500,000 hectares, about 1 million acres in China of solar greenhouses. They're used a little bit in the United States, not as much as they could be. They're very energy efficient. They typically consist of an earthen wall on the north side, if you're in the northern hemisphere, and plastic then facing the south side. They're very energy efficient. I'll show a couple of pictures of them here in a second. You'll see on the right side, you'll see kind of an earthen wall built up, and the sunlight comes in from the south, penetrates through the plastic, heats up that earthen wall, and that actually acts to then subsequently heat that tunnel or greenhouse at night. Very energy efficient. You can see how packed full you can get these things. In some parts of China, they'll actually put a grass insulating type mat, as you can see on the left side of the screen, that gets rolled down over these tunnels at night to provide insulation. That's very labor intensive and it might not work here, but solar greenhouses are very efficient and is something worth considering. There's a local grower I work with here that has a take on a solar greenhouse. He basically had a large building on his farm, painted the south-facing wall black, and then built a solar greenhouse type structure. When the sun comes in, it heats up that concrete block wall. And there's some tomato plants in here now, but he has about an 80-member CSA, organic CSA here, and he starts most of his transplants in here. And so he doesn't have to pay for heating a greenhouse. He can grow his own organic transplants, which might be hard to find depending upon where you live. And it works out very well for him. So what can you grow in a high tunnel? Well, just about anything, whatever your market can support. Tomatoes, greens. We have several growers here that grow beans in high tunnels. That might be kind of an anomaly, but in the eastern part of the state, we have a lot of heirloom half-runner beans here, and they get very, very good prices at farmers markets. And so when there's a demand for something, it's definitely worthwhile pursuing. Flowers I'm not going to talk about flowers today, but they're a huge moneymaker for market growers. High tunnels can keep them very, very clean, keeps the rain off them, and they work very well. Peppers, small fruits, cucurbits, just about anything you can think of. Folks are even growing dwarf cherries in high tunnels. Here's a shot of tomatoes. This particular grower is growing indeterminate tomatoes in this high tunnel. And this shot was about the first week of March in Kentucky, so they can get a significant jump on the season. Here's some lettuce mixed in with some greens and then green onions. This is a tunnel from the grower in Owensboro. In a state like Kentucky, where we have cool, cloudy winters and falls, we do a lot of greens during that time of the year. And then when we get a lot of sun, we do them tomatoes and so forth in the spring. We can do spinach. We can actually pull spinach through the winter in that low-cost UK tunnel. It works very well for that. Colored bell peppers. This is actually a research trial we did here in Lexington. And we have a lot of problems in Kentucky with bacterial leaf spotted peppers. There's a lot of modern hybrids that have leaf spot resistance. But for organic growers that want to grow some colored bell peppers, sometimes you can't find the resistance in those varieties that you want to grow. And there's really nothing that is effective organically for bacterial leaf spot pepper. And so we've taken that modified kind of cheap University of Kentucky tunnel and basically made a rain structure out of it. And it keeps the rain off, keeps the rain splash down, and it produced beautiful colored organic bell peppers that we got a great price premium. For some things, this might not be worth it, but the price premium for these peppers was definitely paid off for this type of tunnel. The Haygrove tunnel could also be used for this type of production. Small fruits, like I covered earlier in the Haygrove tunnels, work very, very well. So why use a high tunnel? Well, you can capitalize on your early or late year round market prices. For growers that are trying to direct sell to restaurants. It works great for retail sales or restaurant sales. It may not be practical for the wholesale market, although I do have some organic wholesalers that it is practical. They get a high enough premium for their product. And really, for organic farmers in wet climates, it can keep the rain off crops, and that's a struggle that we have here in the southeast United States. We have a very rainy climate. We get about 48 to 50 inches of rain a year, and so we can keep the rainfall off our crops, and it makes for a much better product. So some benefits, typically, like I said earlier, we get about anywhere from a 15 to a 50 degree increase in day temperatures. A lot of folks talk about minimum night temperatures. What am I going to get out of this tunnel as far as frost protection? In a double-layer polyethylene tunnel, typically we see on average about a 6 to 7 degree increase at most farms. We put data loggers out at about 12 different farms throughout the state, and on average we get about 6 to 7 degree increase in air temperature. There have been some results from Dr. Michael Bomford at Kentucky State University that showed a much higher increase in soil temperature. On a single-layer polytunnel, you only get about a 2 to 3 degree increase in temperature. We've had some in eastern Kentucky. We get 33 at night versus 30. A double tunnel, where you actually build a single-layer polytunnel, and then on really cold nights you might bring another layer of plastic or remay over plants. We've seen about a 7 degree increase in temperature, so that's an option as well. Here's just a shot of a cheap low tunnel within a tunnel. Basically, it's this single layer PVC tunnel, and then here you see some spinach with we'll just drape some plastic over it when the nights get really cold. It's fairly labor intensive, but it's something that some growers that don't want to invest the capital on a larger tunnel do. Double layer versus single. If you are doing a double layer polytunnel, you might need to run electricity to run a blower motor. Usually those layers need about 2 or so inches of air for insulation between them, and you're going to have to generally run 110 AC out to your high tunnel. So that's something to keep in mind. If you have to run a wire, half a mile, that might be something to reconsider. There's an alternative to inflation. We have a lot of Amish and Mennonite growers here in the state that do high tunnel production, and they do not use electricity, and so they've actually gone to inserting foam blocks between their layers of plastic. In this particular picture, this grower purchased, I think they're about 5-inch thick foam blocks. Of course, 5 inches is more than you want, but you see between the blocks the plastic gets a little tighter. And this actually works very, very well, and you don't have to worry about running electricity. It's a little bit more labor intensive to shove those blocks in there when you're putting your tunnel up, but it works pretty well. And so it's something to think about. Some other benefits of high tunnels, temperature. It's not just the minimum nightly temperature that's important. Think about growing degree days. We don't really use them a lot in vegetable production. We use them more in insect models or fruit production. But the general idea is the same. Tomatoes don't grow very much below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So the more hours we can keep those plants above 50 degrees, the more growth we're going to get. So it's not just, am I going to get 7 degrees of frost protection out of this thing? But, how much of the day is going to be above that kind of that 50-degree threshold? Here's some data we have from high tunnel temperatures that we did in February in 2004. And you'll see the bottom red line is temperatures outside the tunnel, daily high temperatures and so forth, and then inside the tunnel. And so you can definitely see the number of days where you're getting above that 50-degree threshold and the number of hours you're there in the beginning of February. And so, and this was a single-layer plastic tunnel. So that's something to think about. We've done some demonstrations in eastern Kentucky. This is Lawrence County, eastern Kentucky. This is kind of deep in the heart of Appalachia. Very difficult to farm here. Very small plots, not a lot of flat land. A lot of river bottoms are farmed. But this is a demonstration we did actually with our low-cost UK design. We had pulled the plastic off it at this point. And this picture was taken on June 20th in 2008. We planted the variety Christa. It's a standard determinate tomato. And these were planted on the same day, April 24th, 2008. And you'll see by June 20th the vast difference in size of those greenhouse or high tunnel tomatoes, rather. They've actually got some small green fruit on them. And they were 2 weeks earlier, coming from just that single layer tunnel, and ripe fruit was sold July 20th, which is pretty early for that part of the state. Western Kentucky is a lot warmer. Fruit comes off earlier than that. But this particular grower was selling to farmers markets and was able to receive a premium price on their product for 2 weeks, and it definitely paid for that tunnel. Other benefits, like I mentioned, it keeps the rain off plants, decreasing incidence of bacterial spot and pepper. It also decreases cracking in tomatoes. We've used these for cherry tomato production. A lot of times we have problems with organic and conventional cherry tomato production when you get a heavy rain and they crack and fall off the plant, and so that's another great benefit. Some important considerations that I wanted to cover. Some of them are very crop-specific, but others are general and apply to a range of crops. Obviously, cost is the number one consideration, but locating your tunnel, light levels during the winter months, insect management, disease management, rotation, that's a big one, and fertility management, particularly in organic production. So costs. Estimates for a 24 by 96 tunnel with 4-foot sidewalls and associated parts is about $1.67 per square foot, and that's with me or you assembling the tunnel. It may be a little bit more expensive in different parts of the country, or even less, but I just priced that the other day here in central Kentucky. Returns from one season, spring and summer. We had one grower, he had $2.21 per square foot, and that was mixed production, doing tomatoes, peppers, and beans. And he had typically about 8 square feet per plant. Obviously, he had a lot less than that for beans and so forth, and more than that for some other crops. But if you took the whole tunnel and counted the number of plants he had about 8 square feet per plant. So they were spread fairly far apart, probably too far apart. Part of that was because he had a Gothic-type structure. You'll see on the bottom of the screen, a Gothic-type structure doesn't have those straight sidewalls. And so it was very difficult for him to grow right up against the sides of that tunnel. And so basically that was wasted space. Another grower that was doing indeterminate tomatoes, heirloom tomatoes, about almost 5 square feet per plant, he returned $6.80 per square foot. And he had sidewalls. So that's one of the benefits. You're able to fit a lot more stuff in there, cut down on your square feet per plant. And that particular grower made about $19,000 from his tunnel that year. It was very profitable. Locating your tunnels. For maximum sunlight interception, if you're at 40 degrees north or further south, you should be oriented in a north-south direction. If above 40 degrees north, orient them in an east-west direction. If multiple bay tunnels, then orient them north-south, regardless of where you are. But something to think about with high tunnels is that wind is also an important issue. When you orient your tunnel, a lot of folks I've seen will put them on ridge tops because they do get a lot of sun. However, wind can be an issue. High winds can obviously destroy tunnels. If you are putting up a tunnel, strong end walls will make a huge difference. And so I would spend a lot of time on making my end walls strong. We had some growers in the state. We had heavy winds come through last year. We had growers that had very strong, sturdy end walls, a very similar tunnel design. Their tunnels fared well. We had growers whose end walls were weak and flexed, and one of them, the door popped open. Once that air got in there, it destroyed the tunnel. So really consider that. Or also consider wind breaks. That's something that has worked well for some growers. But really, the wind damage, here you'll see a larger tunnel. Was almost completely destroyed. The plastic, you can see, started to pull off and bent all the bows in the tunnel, and that was at 70 miles an hour. This particular grower, however, did not roll up his sidewalls when the wind came through. And so the wind just got right up underneath that and tore the thing apart. So definitely be aware that wind can destroy these things. Light intensity. This is true maybe not in the southwest or the deep south, but as you get further north in the country, your total accumulated daily light levels greatly drop starting in the fall and through the winter. And that's light intensity and total duration. In Kentucky, for example, the total daily accumulation of light is about 14% in January of that of July. Shorter days, less light intensity, more cloud cover. And so we've had some problems with this, though. Even if temperature is high enough, folks are trying to grow plants like tomatoes. There's just not a good light, enough light for growth and development. And so this is something for growers around the country as you go further north. If you're thinking about what crops to put in your tunnel, either in the fall or the spring, just think about light levels. As you're moving from the fall into the winter, light levels will drop, and it may be more difficult to do a crop like tomatoes. Typically, folks here will do tomatoes in the spring followed by a greens crop in the early winter and fall. Here's just a bar graph to show how light levels drop here. This is provided in a publication by Dr. Bob Anderson, a former faculty member here at UK. And as you can see in August, if you're 100% by October, those light levels, total light intensity, that's total numbers of daylight and light intensity, micromoles per meter per second square, drop to about 40%. And so if, just when that high tunnel would be useful in October and November, your light levels are dropping so much so that it's very difficult to set a lot of good quality fruit. And then they remain low until you hit, March. And so if you're going in early spring with a plant where you're just trying to put on some foliar growth in February and March, that's a better situation than if you're going into the fall. Some things to think about insect management. Due to limited air movement and very high plant populations, because tunnels are expensive, you're trying to maximize your productivity. Insect pests such as whitefly and aphids may become problematic. In our experience, beneficial insects have worked very well in high tunnels. Lady beetles and lacewings both have worked well. Lady beetles and recently have been a lot less expensive than lacewings, and so definitely they've worked very well for aphids for us, and so it's something I could recommend to growers. Other common insect pests, due to higher temperatures and drier conditions in tunnels, things that you might normally not run into in a field situation, mites and thrips can be problematic. We rarely have problems with mites on tomatoes in the field, organic or conventional or otherwise here in Kentucky, but we do run into mite problems in high tunnels because sometimes it can get very dry in there. You'll see a shot on the right side, that's a tomato leaf with a severe mite infestation. Another thing to think about, tomato spotted wilt virus is common in tomatoes. It's spread by thrips. It's something we don't run into much in the field here, but because of sometimes we get populations of thrips in high tunnels, it's something to think about. There are tomato spotted wilt resistant cultivars available, though, which is a good tool to use as an organic farmer. Viruses associated with ornamentals can also be an issue. I know a lot of folks are growing cut flowers and so forth for a market situation, but sometimes they share viruses that don't really show up on the ornamental but can be devastating. So if at all possible, we really encourage people to have separate tunnels for cut flower and vegetable operation. That's not always possible, though. Disease management, this is kind of a big sticker. Growers must rotate within tunnels or move tunnels. Elliott Coleman has popularized using skids to move tunnels, and I think this is the best solution to rotation problems. I think this is I would encourage growers to look into his system. I think it's fantastic. Many growers do not move tunnels and henceforth have disease issues. A lot of farmers might use cement to set their poles, which they don't need to do, but in some cases then that tunnel becomes unmovable. There's not a lot of soil options that organic farmers have. I wanted to highlight some research by Dr. Mike Bomford here at Kentucky State University that he's done with solarization and biofumigation. And then, of course, you can graft with resistant rootstocks, and I think that was covered last week. Sclerotinia, sclerotiorum, timber rot is a very common disease that we see in tomatoes. You see it in lettuces. You see kind of a white mold on greens and lettuces in the greenhouse. In tomatoes, you'll see kind of a brown lesion that's about a foot off the ground, and then it'll eventually dry out the plant, and the plant will crack open, and you'll see these the little sclerotia. They'll fall out of the plant into the soil, and that's how they stick around. And this can be very devastating. I've had growers that might have had one or two plants in their first couple of years in the high tunnels get affected. By their fourth or fifth year growing in that same high tunnel, they've got 40 or 50 plants, and this can be a big problem. And there's virtually no control measures for it. So Dr. Mike Bomford at Kentucky State University led a SARE-funded project looking at solarization and biofumigation of high tunnels. In his findings, from what he has posted and talks that he has given that I've witnessed, solarization worked very well, killed nearly all the sclerotia. The biofumigation in the study did not work as well, and there was no interaction between the two. You can go to his website at Kentucky State University, biofumigation. You'll see the link on the bottom there. But basically, what he found was using biofumigant mustard. He did not have any effect on the sclerotia. What he did was bury sclerotia at different depths in the greenhouse, dig them up, and then try to regrow them. And with the biofumigation, it didn't work as well. However, with solarization, basically putting a clear plastic, a layer of clear plastic down during the summer, letting that plastic heat up, it actually did a very good job killing sclerotia near the surface. And so I would encourage folks that are interested in this to look at his work, but the solarization has been very effective. Some other diseases, humidity in the spring can be very high, resulting in the spread of some diseases that you don't normally see in tomatoes. Leaf mold, botrytis, powdery mildew. Powdery mildew, usually we don't see a lot of. Rain will wash the spores off, but in a humid but dry environment, or rain-free environment rather, you can actually get a lot of powdery mildew. So these are things to keep an eye out for. If you're used to growing in the field, you might run into some new problems, and it's just something to be aware of as an organic farmer. Another thing I wanted to cover is high salts. We see this a lot more in conventionally farmed high tunnels than organic high tunnels, where people are using a lot of mineral fertilizers. Nonetheless, high tunnels never get rain, so salts can accumulate. Some salts are obviously worse than others. Sodium is very pernicious and hard to leach out of the soil. And it can be very toxic at high levels. If you're using county water, and a lot of folks I know that are farming small acreage, their high tunnels, it's not worth it to dig a well. They'll just use county water. Sometimes your county or city water can be very high in sodium. And if I was growing in a high tunnel using county water, I would contact my local water authority and find out what levels of sodium is in the water. Really, to hammer this point home is this picture. This picture was taken from, this is not an organic farmer, it was a conventional farmer, but the same premise holds true. Basically, this grower was growing in a 48-foot-long high tunnel for about 5 years, growing tomatoes. Everything looked the same, everything looked fine. Then last year, he added an additional 48 feet to his tunnel and then started growing a new crop in it. And it wasn't until then that he realized how poorly his crop that was growing in the old ground was. You can see those tomatoes, these are the same variety, planted on the same day, grown in the same tunnel. And you can see the stuff in the front that had been grown in for several years. It's about a third the size of the stuff in the back. There was no disease present. What we did was we took soil samples, and it ended up that he had over 700 pounds of sodium per acre in the soil in the front of that house. And the reason for that was because the county water had high levels of sodium. After years of watering, it built up, and it was really hurting his plants. He never realized it until he had something to compare it to. So this is something for growers that have been growing in tunnels for several years. You might want to get your soil tested. It definitely would be worth it. So like I said, salts are generally a problem more so for folks that are using mineral fertilizers, not for organic fertilizers. But nonetheless, if you do have high levels of certain salts in your water source, something to think about. One way to fix it is leaching them from the soil. Of course, if you have high salts in your city water and you use your city water to leach the salts, that could be a problem. But according to the California Fertilizer Association 1985 publication, 6 inches of water would leach about 50% of the salts in the top foot of the soil. 12 inches of water would leach about 80% of salts, and so on. A lot of what we have is when growers decide to change their plastic out here, because we do have very wet falls and winters, They'll leave the plastic off for a couple of months. Typically, we'll get anywhere between 8 to 12 inches of rain during that time, and that works fairly well to leach salts. For very high levels of sodium, the relationship's a little different. You may need significantly more water. But this is something to think about. And the best way to leach that water if you have winter rains is probably to pull that plastic off for a few months when you're changing it. Organic fertility in high tunnels can be a challenge. Often plants are very, very tightly spaced, and so you can't really apply your field rate. So we have a lot of our growers are using about 1.5 times their field rates of fertility for their tunnel. You can run into a lot of nutrient deficiencies. Some of our growers put all their fertility out pre-plant. A lot of them use compost. The mineralization rate is a lot different in a warmer tunnel than in the field. Just be aware of that. I've had folks use cover crops, but they're not as common, I'd say. And typically during the time when you want to grow your cover crop is when you want a crop in there. And so I'd say most folks generally use a compost mix. I do have some that do utilize granular organic fertilizers or inject liquid organic fertilizers. That can get fairly expensive quickly. However, I do have some growers that keep some liquid organic fertilizers on hand just so they can inject that and solve any deficiency issues that they may have. Different types of injectors that you can use. One is a proportional injector. Here, a chemilizer you see in the top left screen. They work very well. Another type is a Venturi type. That's in the top right-hand side of the screen, a Mazai injector. These I found don't work quite as well on the smaller areas inside a high tunnel. Typically, you need a fairly large volume of water in order to pull the fertility solution into your drip irrigation, and so a lot of folks are moving to the proportional type injectors. And then on the bottom part of the screen, you'll see a fellow there with just a 2.5 gallon sprayer. And I've had growers that will mix these up with their fertilizer solution, get high pressure in that, inject that into their system, and it works fairly well for a small area. These are all tools that you might be able to use for fertility. I'll briefly cover excessive nitrogen. It's usually not an issue for organic high tunnel growers, but occasionally I've seen it. Generally, because you're putting in greater fertility in the field, we have some growers that will go kind of over the top. Excessive nitrogen fertility can actually result in a tomato in tomatoes called bullishness. It affects determinate tomatoes much more than indeterminate, and we found that occurs more in cloudy, cool weather than in the hot, sunny weather. Plants will tend to grow out of it, but it will hinder pollination. And here's just a couple pictures of what bullishness looks like. You'll see some new growth that'll be kind of distorted and curled. Sometimes it looks like almost like an herbicide injury or growth regulator injury. But in this case, this was actually caused by high nitrogen. We had a lot of problems with pollination, though, when this occurred, or actually not pollination, but bloom set. And you'll see sometimes on the left side of the screen the leaves will start growing again out past your flowers. I haven't run into it much at all with organic farmers, but just something to keep in mind. Irrigation. I'm running kind of quick through these slides because I don't want to go over my time here, but I think I've got about 5 or so more minutes of the main part of the talk here. Irrigation will be increased due to your lack of rain, obviously. That's something to think about. If you are not having to irrigate your field because you're not getting any rain, you're going to have to irrigate more frequently. We do see a lot more blossom end rot in tomatoes and peppers in high tunnels just because of this. Blossom end rot's calcium deficiency, but oftentimes it's caused by a irregularity in watering. And so, be aware of this, that you're going to have to stay on top of your irrigation. And then pollination. It's something I wanted to spend a couple minutes on. Pollination is very important in high tunnels, even for crops like tomatoes that are out in the field. You don't necessarily think of pollinators with tomatoes, but in a high tunnel environment where there's not a lot of wind movement, pollinators are very, very important. We've had growers that do not get pollinators. They have a sealed-up high tunnel and don't go through there and move their plants at all, and they get a very, very poor fruit set. if you're growing any sort of cucurbit crops, I would strongly encourage you to have pollinators. It's very, very important. Generally, a Class C hive of bumblebees is enough for about 600 to 700 tomato plants. So depending upon what you're growing, a Class C hive will work for most growers. Bumblebees are very good pollinators in high tunnels. If you have excessive numbers of visits, you'll see some bruising on your flowers. And I'll show you a picture of a bruised flower quickly. If you're not getting any bruising at all, then if you don't have any pollinators, you don't have any bruising, you might not be getting any pollination. Here's a Class C hive that we get. You can get them from a variety of manufacturers. They're relatively inexpensive. And if you are doing high tunnel tomatoes, I would encourage you to use a Class C hive. Basically, when you pull the box apart, this is what the hive looks like. The hive's that little plastic container. The bees are fed a sugar solution that they can reach in the bottom of that. And sometimes there's a little door in there. If you're doing work in the high tunnel where it's going to be open or something, you can temporarily close the door of that tunnel, or of the hive rather, so that you don't lose all your bees. Here's kind of an excessively bruised flower, but that's what you'll see after pollination, after a number of visits. You'll see just some browning on that flower, and that's just from the bee working the flower there. Now, I think I've gone on probably, I don't want to go on too long.
Unmuted.
With heating high tunnels, and then take some questions from folks, and then at the end of my talk, I've got some instructions on how to build a low-cost high tunnel. For heating high tunnels, generally, like I said earlier, high tunnels are not heated usually. But now some growers have gotten so big they're intermittently heating high tunnels using a wood stove or boiler. A word of caution about wood stove, here's kind of a homemade wood stove that a grower I work with uses. Stoves inside the tunnel often leak, and so you can really harm your plants. And so that's something very important to think about. One of the better, more successful things I've seen people use is a hot water heating system. They'll have a homemade boiler type system, and then they'll run pipes throughout the greenhouse, heated water. That water retains heat and heats the greenhouse very effectively. And if you were deciding to heat a high tunnel, it's really only economical for those that are using wood, that have access to quantities of wood. This is definitely the system I would go with. So now I'd like to say thank you. I don't think I'll be able to get to the construction part of things, but I'll be happy to take any questions if folks have them.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I'd like to repeat for any listeners who might have missed the beginning of the webinar that if you have a question that you want to ask Tim, you can type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. And if the question box is closed, you can click on the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. And we have a lot of questions coming in, and we will read them out, and Tim will answer as many as he has time for. And Tim, maybe you could also refer people to where they could find more construction information. So let me just ask, you want to do that first, and then I'll ask the first question?
Sure. There's actually a fairly detailed article on constructing a low-cost high tunnel using PVC pipe on the eOrganic website. All you have to do is go to eExtension and type in low-cost high tunnel, or even you could Google just organic high tunnel construction, and it'll be one of the top 2 or 3 results that pop up. And it's basically what I was going to present is very detailed. It has all the parts and stuff that you could use to make it. So that is available through eExtension eOrganic. Okay,
thank you. And for anybody who wants to know, the website address for the eOrganic is www.extension.org/organic_production. And so I'll just start reading out the questions in the order that they came in. The first question was, how do the UK structures hold up in 20 to 30 mile-an-hour winds?
Actually, we've had them hold up in more than that, as long as the end wall is the end walls are tied in pretty well and the doors stay closed. We've had some problems where folks did not secure the doors and wind will get in there and tear the tunnel apart. But as long as these sides are pulled down, they've actually done fairly well, in my experience anyway, with 20 to 30 mile-an-hour winds.
Okay, well, we have two more wind questions coming in after that. One of them was, should the end wall face the dominant wind direction? And then the next question was, does cementing in poles not make the high tunnel more wind resistant?
So I would orient my tunnel so that you do face the prevailing winds. And also, the cementing them in probably would make them more resistant. But what we found is that once you cement stuff in, it becomes a real pain. What we've actually gone to using is cedar 4x4 posts, and we put them down about 30 inches in the ground at both end walls, and that has worked pretty well to sure things up.
Okay. Next question, what is the negative impact of tomato blossom bruising?
I haven't seen a lot of negative impact. I'm not sure if there's an association with excessive bruising in some of the disorders, such as like a zippering. I just don't know if there's a correlation between the two. I haven't seen a problem with growers that have excessive bruising, but I would imagine if you did have a very, very large number of visits, you might run into some fruit disorders. But like I said, I do not have any data that would show there's an increase in zippering, for example, or something like that. That's not to say it doesn't happen. I just don't have any data.
Okay. Where can I find information about the total accumulated daily light levels in my area?
That's a good question. A lot of colleges of agriculture have either departments of meteorology or weather centers. Here in Kentucky, we've actually got a pretty nice statewide weather mesonet system, and some of those places have light meters on them. We just happen to have a light meter at our research farm where we got those numbers from. If you cannot find it through your College of Ag, I would contact your land grant departments of horticulture or plant science. It might take some digging, but chances are, if they've got any greenhouses, they probably got some light meters, and they might be able to help you out. But there's probably not a central repository that I know of that has a lot of that information.
Okay. How often do you recommend moving the high tunnel?
Ideally, and obviously, you have to be very practical here. If you could move it after every season, if you could set it up so that you could either pull it on skids or something, that would be the ideal situation. If you grew tomatoes and then had greens or something like that, and then for your next spring tomato crop, if you could move it, that would be obviously the ideal situation. We've had growers that have grown the same crop in there for 5 or 6 straight years and will insist that it's not a problem, but sooner or later, disease is going to get you.
Okay, before I ask the next question, I just wanted to say that I typed in the web address for Tim's eOrganic article, and that should appear in all of your question boxes. So if you open up that question box with the plus sign, you'll be able to find the web address for that article. Thank you to the person who sent that in. The next question is, does the plastic affect our organic rating?
No, but I would, at least here with our Department of Ag does a lot of the organic certification, and the plastic does not. But we've had some issues where people use pressure-treated lumber in their end walls, and you cannot use pressure-treated lumber unless you completely, at least here, unless you completely wrapped it in plastic and made sure that there's no contact with the ground. And so the plastic hasn't been an issue, but do not use pressure-treated lumber.
Okay, what average tomato yield per plant have you seen?
For a determinate tomato plant, we have seen, depending upon the variety, in high tunnels here in the spring going into early summer, for a determinate tomato plant, we've seen anywhere between 8.5 and 14 pounds per plant. So it's kind of a wide range there, but a lot of it's variety driven. And then for indeterminates in a high tunnel, I've had several growers that used big beef, actually, and they have reported yields carrying that through midsummer, and they've gotten yields close to 20 pounds per plant. Those are probably our best growers. A lot of them are down around 15 pounds per plant, but some of our best growers have gotten higher.
Okay. What is your preferred irrigation setup, and do you include these costs in your overall cost estimates? And there was another listener who also wanted to hear more about the costs of the tunnel.
So for the cost of setting up the tunnel, that $1.67 a square foot, I did not include irrigation in that. It was just the construction of the tunnel and so forth. So that's a very good point. I really like to use drip irrigation in a tunnel because if you use a sprinkler in there, it really negates a lot of the benefits that you get from the tunnel, particularly as an organic farmer, keeping the rain off of the plants. So we typically just run drip tape with a small header line, and we irrigate 3 to 4 times a week for a couple hours, and that seems to work very well. And as far as the costs, that cost was just looking up I believe it was a 24 by 96 tunnel with sidewalls, using I believe it was a double layer 4mm plastic.
Okay. Can you move high tunnels to improve soil problem?
If you could, I would encourage it. I know a lot of folks don't like to move them. I would say probably Elliot Coleman's got a very good website that you can look at how he uses his system. I would encourage folks to, if there's any growers that they work with or friends of theirs, if they're growers, if they know anyone moving high tunnels, they might be able to come up with a system that works best for you. But that's the ideal situation, and I wish more folks could move them. Sometimes it's not practical.
Okay, we have some comments coming in. The name of the article on eOrganic, and you could type this into Google as well, is Low Cost High Tunnel Construction by Tim Coolong. And if you just go to the eOrganic website that I sent into the question box, you have to go to vegetable production and then season extension to get to the tunnel articles. But there are about 7 additional articles on eOrganic about tunnel construction, so that's a great resource to go to. And another comment came in about weather history and how you can go to Weather Underground to get weather history information. Now we have a little bit more time. Let's see, one other comment came in about how a grower survived 100 mile-per-hour winds with secure end walls in a 30 by 96 foot tunnel. So we have a little additional time. We've had several requests for more construction information. So unless we get more questions, perhaps Tim could just spend the rest of the time talking a little bit more about construction.
Yeah, that's. I've got about 15 or 18 slides on how to build the low-cost tunnel. I can go through that real quick in the next. I think we have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll go through that then real quick. Okay, so building a low-cost tunnel. We use these a lot in Kentucky because we have a lot of farmers that are interested in doing tunnels, but they don't know if they want to spend the money right away. I mean, $3,000 to $4,000 investment for someone that's selling at the farmer's market might not be reasonable. And so these are pictures from various demonstration tunnels that we've put up throughout the state, and just our experiences with them. Generally what we do is we build the end walls first. We build the end walls during the winter time, and they are approximately 12 feet wide on the bottom, and I'll show you some pictures of the end walls in a minute. And it's very easy to build them in the winter time. We make anchors with auger flight, and this is kind of a variation on the Haygrove type anchor, but they've worked very well. You can also use a rebar type anchor if you don't want to weld something up, but this is something that's worked well for us. We lay our beds and transplant because these are very quick to assemble, almost like a low tunnel type situation. A lot of times we'll lay our plastic beds and transplant before we assemble the tunnel. Not always, but sometimes we do that. We've had some growers where we did demonstrations over 2 years ago, and they're still using these tunnels. The nice thing about them is they're very easy to move. So here's just a plot we had out at our research farm, just some spinach on plastic. There you'll see it had already been planted probably a couple weeks prior to that. Those rows are about 6 feet on center apart. And like I said, typically the tunnel is about 12 feet apart at the base and just about 6 feet tall in the center. These are the augers that we make. We just get, in this case, we actually got used pipe that was going to be scrapped. It was very inexpensive. I don't think I would go out and buy a brand new pipe. It can be kind of expensive. And we bought 4-foot sections of auger flight. You can buy these at like a tractor supply or a local farm supply place or building supply place. And we basically cut a single turn of the auger flight off and then just tack weld it to the bottom of that auger. And we pound the end of it so it's kind of pointed. And then we put a little hook on it. Now these augers are about 24 inches in length. And that hook is around 18 inches or so up on the auger. Up on the anchor, rather. We lay these out in the field. Here you see a couple of students that we worked with that were laying them out on 8-foot distances in the field. And then we were fortunate enough, we had an old hydraulic motor that we hooked into our tractor that we used to turn these into the ground. And I understand a lot of growers will not necessarily have one of these on hand, but I've seen these at used equipment dealers and so forth for about $100, and it's something that you can weld up and make if you've got a buddy or if you've got got some welding skills or so forth. But just think about basically all this functions to do is to turn those augers into the ground. Do be aware that if you hook something like that to about a 150 horsepower tractor, it can completely flip you around. Then we take 1.5-inch PVC pipe. What we've done, because PVC tends to break down in the sun, sometimes we'll paint it with a cheap latex paint, and that seems to have worked pretty well. We buy 20-foot sections of it, 1.5-inch PVC pipe, and the 20-foot sections work real well. You can get them at Lowe's or Home Depot, and they work very well because they're the perfect length. You don't have to cut them. Then here we put the bows. This is at our farm again. We're just putting them across at the bottom. They're about 12 feet apart, and then it's just over 6 feet in the center. You'll see there. That's the bows completely up. This is about I think this particular tunnel is about 160-ish feet or so. And you'll see just how tall they are. The person in there is about 5.5 feet tall. And so this, once you get the augers in, that takes about half hour to put them in the ground. It takes about 5 minutes to put this PVC pipe. We haven't had any problems with the pipe cracking or breaking. And we've had pipe last as long as, with some latex paint, as long as 5 years. These are the end walls that we build in the wintertime. You'll see these. This one right here is built out of pressure-treated lumber that was used on a conventional farm. If you were just if you were an organic grower, I would use either poplar or cedar. Definitely, I wouldn't use treated wood. We build these end walls in advance, and you'll see that where the end walls meet the bows. Here you'll see a close-up of it. We just make these little adjustable blocks of wood, basically. We cut little notches in them with a hole saw, and then we just screw these onto our end walls so we can adjust it so it meets up with the PVC pipe perfectly once you get in the field. And that seems to work very well. And then here you see that shot again. Something that we started to do in our latest, version of this tunnel is we run a pipe down the center of it. You can buy a top link pipe for chain link fence very inexpensively. It's nice because they slide into each other. And then these little hooks, they used to be called J hooks, but now they're simply called cross connectors. If you Google cross connectors in greenhouse, there's several companies that manufacture them. They're about $1.50 a piece, and they're very nice because they're aluminum, they're flexible. You just bend them over the PVC pipe and then bolt them together. Work really, really well. Besides the end walls, this is probably the one thing that we've done to improve the rigidity of this tunnel more than anything else. Once this metal pipe is set up down the center, it makes a huge difference. We used to tie the whole all the bows together, but now what we've gone to is just tying the last 3 bows on either end, basically to the end wall. You may not think that it actually, you see some rope there, you might not think that it works very well, but you'd be surprised. Basically, we tie some of that rope to one of those hooks on an auger. We wrap it up around the end wall and back down, and then we do one the opposite direction. We start at the end wall, we come up to that 3rd bow, and then back down. And that just kind of ties the end walls in. Also, we use anchors. It's very hard to see in this picture. I don't know if you'll see my mouse cursor. This is a small anchor about 5 or 6 feet from the end wall. This is actually a mobile home foundation anchor. You can get them for about $14, $15 a piece. They're pretty cheap. We auger them in the ground, and then we also tie the end wall into that. I've actually found that if you just drive some 4x4s in the ground, you can do without some of this roping, but this seems to work pretty well. And then when we lay our plastic, we just pull our plastic out alongside the tunnel. As long as you don't have anything sticking up, it goes pretty quickly. Just unroll it. We pull it over the tunnel. As long as it's not windy, this could be a 3-person job. If it's windy, we've had windy days where we had 10 or 12 people hanging onto that plastic with all we could, and it still was very, very difficult. We attach the plastic to the end walls using channels, and we actually use this wiggle wire, channel wire it's called sometimes. This is really nice. I like it a lot more than the old-fashioned channels. This just goes into channels, and you can reuse it. You just bend it back and forth, and it holds that plastic in. It's very, very effective, and it's something that I would encourage folks to use even if they're using a regular high tunnel, not a cheap one. That stuff makes things a lot quicker. And then what we do, once we have the plastic on, we just pull a rope back and forth across the top, just a nylon rope, and we go down. We do every other anchor going one way, and then we come back and do the other anchors. Here you'll see we just wrap it around that little hook we welded on there, and we just twist it, and this helps prevent slipping of the rope. Sometimes you'll have to come back through and tighten things up. Here you see a close-up of it, just looped around each anchor. And then here you see, after you've gone up and down both sides, you'll see this is a tunnel where we did not have that center pole in, but with that pole, it would be a lot flatter across the top. It actually helps with shedding water, too, having that pole. You'll see what's really nice about these is that the way the plastic is on the side, of course, early in the year, if you wanted to, you could bury the edges of that so that you kept all the heat you could. But once it gets warm, what's really nice about this is you can walk down the edge of the tunnel and just pick up on that plastic. And a lot of times, if you have the ropes tight enough, the tension will hold it tight against those poles, and that's how you can vent. And so you prevent it from getting too hot in there. It's really, really nice for venting, this little design. And here you'll see one that we did in southeastern Kentucky that was had some tomatoes in it. We did this actually late in the year, going into the fall. You'll see the tomato plants are fairly large in it, but it works, fairly well. These costs are for back late summer, early fall, and so obviously costs might be a lot different in your area. We have some very reasonable produce dealers here, so we get a lot of these things very inexpensively. The wood for the end walls, of course, if you're using something like cedar, that would be a little bit more. 6 mil plastic was $135 for our 100-foot roll. Our rope, the anchors, I put a price of $60 there. That included the, the auger, the amount of, you don't need a lot of auger flight. And then, of course, if you had to go out and buy pipe, that might be a little more. But if you didn't, that might be a little less. The dead man anchors, or the anchors, the trailer foundation anchors, they're between $12 and $14 a piece. The PVC was pretty inexpensive. The door, accessories, and nails, $385. I would say it's probably more accurate to say about $400 at least. But for getting started, it's pretty pretty reasonable. So that was kind of a quick run through of that, but hopefully folks found it helpful.
Okay, that's great. We had a couple more questions coming in. We'll just try to answer 2 or 3, and then we'll have to stop. We'll try to follow up with those of you who didn't get your question answers after the webinar. But here's one that came in before. We have a high tunnel heated with hot water. Our high tunnel has 2 layers of plastic, and cold air is blown between the 2 layers. Would it be more insulated if warm air was blown between the 2 layers?
Actually, I've had growers ask me that same question. If you were using, let me say, like with the blower motors, some folks will locate them in certain parts of the tunnel so that they might be closer to a heat source. I don't really know how much more insulative capacity you would get with the warmer air. It probably wouldn't hurt too much. I don't know how much it would help, given I definitely probably wouldn't re-rig my whole high tunnel to do that, but I definitely wouldn't hurt.
Okay. Have you ever used conduit instead of PVC or steel frames?
Yes, we've used some low tunnels with conduit. Actually, there's a company that's making a conduit bender. It's basically a pipe bender. I think Johnny Seeds actually has it on the back of their catalog this year. And we've used it for low tunnels, and it works. For the low tunnels, it works really well. Usually the conduit's a little bit too thin for some of the larger structures. Maybe something about 6 feet tall would work. But I can say I have used it for low tunnels, and it has worked really, really well.
Okay. I think this is going to have to be the last question because we're running out of time, but we'll try to follow up with those of you who didn't get their questions answered. Somebody wanted to know, for a tunnel windbreak, any thoughts on stacking round bales or something like that?
Yeah, actually, that wouldn't be a bad idea. We've had that actually would probably work okay. I mean, anything that can block that wind from coming in and hitting your tunnel. We have growers here that might plant a row of cedar trees or something like that, or in the summertime they might plant like sudex or something because it gets so huge. But that actually probably wouldn't be a bad idea.
Okay, we had a comment from someone that said that you would get condensation if you use inside air.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar, and if there's anything that you missed or you'd like to hear it again, or if you'd like to share the link with others, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be available within the next week, along with all the slides on the eOrganic website at www.extension.org/organic_production. And on that website, you can also find out about our upcoming webinars and read Tim's article. Thank you again, Tim, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks everyone for coming.